Last week we finished up a story of the attack on Ai. I saw the much more successful version when they were listening to God. It's a good thing that they will always remember that for the remainder of the book, and they will always listen to God, always ask God what He wants them to do, except for this very next chapter. It gets rough. It's frustrating reading about what they do because they seem so inconsistent. And then I remember how inconsistent I am, how much we can go up and down like this. Nevertheless, we see consequences for their actions, consequences during the times that they don't listen to God, and that will be the case here in Joshua 9 as well. So, verses 1 and 2 give us the response of the surrounding people. Remember, they've just taken Ai, they've had this victory, and question number 1 asks, what are the cities in the land of Canaan planning, and why? Gary.
They're planning to unite together.
Right, yes. And to be suitably impressed by that, you need to remember that the land of Canaan, like we talked about before, is not a nation exactly. It's a collection of peoples. And so there's different cities that are sometimes allied with each other, sometimes warring with each other. They don't always get along. They're not always united. But in this particular case, they're going to be united because there's a threat that is against all of them. So get all these cities, all these kings and peoples together to stand up against Israel and to get them out of here. Anything to add to that? Yeah. All right, Barry.
Except for Gibeon.
Except for Gibeon. Yes.
They're going, wait a minute. They're right on our doorstep. We're not waiting for you guys.
Yeah.
We've got a different plan.
And that is the very interesting story of chapter 9. The one city, the one group of people who break away, not technically more than one city, but who break away from this plan. And that's because, yes, they are nearby. They are a realistic target very soon. If not next target, it could be very soon. They're just a few miles away from Jerusalem. The Israelites are not that far away from Gibeon. And so there is extreme danger for the Gibeonites, and they come up with a different plan that we read about in this chapter.
They're only about 5 miles from the eye.
Yeah. So
I can see stuff over there.
right.
You
Yeah. This is not a good position to be in when Israel has just, trounced Jericho, has destroyed Ai, and the Gibeonites are looking around and saying, like, we're next. We're so obviously next, and this is a very bad time. So you got your list there in verse 1 of the different people who are uniting together, Hittites and Amorites and Canaanites and Perizzites and Hivites, all these different people who are trying to unite. Kind of a wonderful display of unity here. It won't matter, but it's a display of unity as they're going to try to defeat the Israelites. Okay, let's talk more about Gibeon, because right now Gibeonites are more interesting than these other peoples. The Gibeonites, as Barry was telling us, realized that they're in a lot of danger. They heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, verse 3, and so they come up with a different plan. So question number 2, explain what the Gibeonites do. Who wants to tackle that for us? Yes.
Well, they put old cloths on their donkeys. They did wineskins that are old and cracked, and they have bread that's moldy and crumbling. They have shoes that are all worn out, clothes that are all worn out. I'm wondering where they got these.
Yeah.
It's not something you normally have.
Yeah, kind of interesting. You can almost imagine them going around town saying, who's got old shoes? Who's got old wineskins, we need them here. We've got to travel 5 miles, you know, so we need to act like it's been a lot farther than that. And that's the goal here, right? To make the Israelites believe that they've come from much farther away. Even though they're just a handful of miles down the road, they need the Israelites to believe that they're from some distant land. They've heard of the Israelites' exploits in this area. So what's the point of this? What are they trying to accomplish by going to Israel and pretending they've come from far away? Gary?
They want to treaty with them,
Yeah.
be spared. I get the impression that they're trying to deceive them into thinking they're so far away, they're not a part of the nations they're supposed to conquer.
Yeah. Right. If these people really are so far away, then it's not a big deal to make a covenant of peace with them. This also lines up pretty nicely with what we see in Deuteronomy 20 on what they were supposed to do with cities that were more distant from the land that they were there to conquer. The Canaanites and all these peoples who were in the promised land, they were devoted to destruction. But these other cities, if they came across them, they were supposed to offer them terms of peace. They were supposed to really only get in conflict, in battle with them if they were going to resist them. That's kind of what happened with Sihon and Og, right? That these were cities that didn't have to be destroyed, didn't have to be conquered, but they were because they stood in the Israelites' way. So God is not sending the Israelites on a path of world domination to just attack anyone and everyone indiscriminately. This is a war that is focused on a certain area, focused on a certain people, and they're not supposed to make treaties with these people, but with others, with other cities. Well, yes, you can make a covenant of peace with them if they're going to leave you alone. I don't know if the Gibeonites knew that or not. It's possible that they did, or it's possible that it was some dumb luck. I don't know exactly how they would have known, but they may have just gotten lucky here in the fact that the deceit that they were going to try, but the plan and the deception actually aligned with what God told them that they could do with some of these distant nations. But even if they don't have particular knowledge of God's instructions to them, this is a pretty reasonable thing. Like Gary was saying, that if they're from a distant land, well, we don't need to unnecessarily make enemies. Why not make peace with the people who are in the periphery? And then we don't have to worry about them anymore. That's a reasonable thing for the Israelites to want to do. So that's the goal here. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, they sweeten the deal by making themselves servants.
Oh, yes.
They are surrendering their services to Israel.
Yes. Yeah, so that adds to the plausibility of this too. If the Gibeonites really are so afraid of the Israelites, then it's pretty logical for them to say, hey, we are your servants. We are surrendering to you, and do with us what you will. Just spare our lives and make this covenant of peace with us. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, this shows their faith in the power of God.
Mm-hmm.
They know what Rahab knew,
Yeah.
but they're stuck. So they devise this plan. Now the other kings of the various cities, they're resisting God,
Yeah.
and they're going to fight against him.
Yes.
But these people have said, we can't. Israel has the true and living God, so we're going to have to live under that.
Yeah. We'll talk some more about that, too, because there's an interesting contrast and comparison in exactly what the Gibeonites are doing. But yeah, they are not resisting like the other peoples and other kings are, in that they're all banding together to fight against Israel, and the Gibeonites seem to realize we're not going to win if we do that. So let's come up with a way to deceive them into making a covenant of peace with us. They have also got some pretty good trickery going just in how they answer questions. So when Joshua asks them, who are you and where are you from, what is their answer?
Well, they don't tell them who they are.
They never really answer that, do
They don't
they?
tell them where they're from. They go off on this other tangent, and they never really answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah, they say a lot of words. They don't actually answer those questions. Andrea, do you want to add to that?
I was going to say that mine says we have come from a land that is very far away. So it doesn't say it's just somewhere far.
Yeah, that's, but it's a little weird to get that sort of answer, right? So, like, if you know, but I'm, new here in California, you can say, where are you from? I say, a faraway place. Go, okay, cool. Where are you from? A faraway place. It's evasive and it's strange. And that's not really the way that people answer unless they're hiding something. And so with the two questions that Joshua and the leaders keep asking this delegation, who are you and where are you from? The who are you never gets answered. They never even give an excuse of an answer of who they are. The where are you from, they always just pivot to a faraway place, a distant land. But then, because that is weird and is going to arouse suspicion, they add something else to their answer. What do they add to their answer to distract them? Yeah, okay, so there's that part. Yes, we are your servants, that kind of flattery there of we're giving ourselves over to you.
Well, they come really quickly to say make a covenant with us.
Mhm.
So little words like you say, not answering the question, but immediately coming back like make a covenant with us.
Yeah.
Little words.
Right.
So you get right on it.
Yeah. Have you ever dealt with a really pushy salesman or something that doesn't want to answer questions, that just wants to close the deal? And I mean pushy to the point of kind of scamming you. They don't really want to get into the details of what you're getting into. They just want you to sign. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting from this. Let's not talk about the details. Let's not talk about exactly who we are. It doesn't even matter. We're from so far away that you don't even need to be concerned with who we are. We just want to make a covenant of peace with you, and can you really argue with that? It's the pushy salesman thing. What else do they add to their answer? Because there is something else too.
Well, I said to prove that we're from far away, look at our clothes. This bread we have was warm when we left, and that's old and frozen.
Yeah, they've got tangible proof. Doesn't necessarily mean anything, but they have tangible proof, right? And obviously that can be faked. So we do have to be aware that sometimes tangible proof still needs to be assessed and looked at, discerned with wisdom to make sure that it is telling you what it's supposed to tell you. John.
They mention the Lord and all the things that have been happening recently.
Yeah, they do. So in pivoting quickly away from the question of who are we, they kind of are flattering the people, we are your servants, and they're flattering the Lord. They're saying, we have heard of your God. We heard what he did, and what incidents do they actually mention?
Egypt, kings on the other side of the Jordan.
Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? Because they mention Egypt and they mention Sihon and Og. They don't mention Jericho and Ai, even though it says that it's Jericho and Ai that really scared them. Why wouldn't they mention the two more recent things?
Because that just proved that they were far away.
Right, yeah. They can't do anything that's too recent, otherwise it doesn't explain why they're already here if they're from so far away. So we need to pick some things that are backwards a little bit in time so that it makes sense that they could have heard about that and left, and they don't know the most recent news of the area that Jericho and Ai have been taken because they're not from around here. They're foreigners. They're from far away. Okay.
Well, what I find interesting is they can communicate verbally. If I went to Mexico and started talking to them, they couldn't understand me probably, and I couldn't understand them. That's why I'm just wondering how they communicated. I guess it's anything you would ever know, but that just struck me as strange that they could communicate verbally.
Yeah, it seems that they had a language in common here for sure. I'm not totally sure all the language breakdowns of this area and how many languages were spoken at this time. Barry, you know anything about that?
Well, prior to Moses' day, several hundreds of years before then, most of the language was in pictograph type language, and the Hebrew and the other languages around that area all grew out of those pictographs, so they have a common base.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it looks real smooth here, but it very likely could have been, what did he say? What's
Yeah.
he saying? Kind of a thing,
Yeah. Common.
So-and-so, and they have this a bit of difficulty understanding each other, but Rahab was able to speak to the spies. They were able to speak to the other nations as they were coming up, but wouldn't let them pass through. So they all have this sort of a common history in their language, but then they're going to have their different dialects.
Yeah, that's probably the answer there of enough connection, enough closeness in the languages to be able to understand reasonably. There are parts of the world, lots of parts of the world, where that's still the case today. If you know Swedish but don't know Norwegian, you kind of do know Norwegian. You know it close enough that you can get by, and there's going to be some tricky spots. There's going to be some bumps in the road, but you can probably have a conversation. A lot of European languages are like that, and then other parts of the world as well have similar things going on. That's probably the answer here, that they're able to communicate enough. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be too much of an obstacle because Rahab's able to talk to the spies. They're able to talk to the various people that they run into as they're going through the land. So that is an interesting note.
Remember that this area is a corridor
Yeah.
for trade from Mesopotamia down into Egypt. So you get a lot of different people running back and forth through there, and so they were possibly multilingual,
Right.
even in the way they spoke.
Yes.
And as we already mentioned, that with all this exposure to a common base, it's just all it's relatable enough to be able to get your thoughts across.
Yeah. And being multilingual sounds strange and very impressive to us, but in lots of places in the world, it's very, very common. Particularly when you have that close association with people who speak these other languages. We live in a country with a very dominant language that does culturally dominate the area, although other languages are spoken here too. But in places like Europe and places like a lot of different areas in Asia, Africa, they do speak multiple languages, and knowing 2 or 3 is not particularly unusual because they're exposed to it a lot more than we are.
These languages had their root in Mesopotamia.
Right.
From where Abraham came.
Yeah.
So you have, as I said, this root and everything, but these traders who come, who say we come from a far country,
Yeah.
they must have been talking about somewhere in Mesopotamia or Mesopotamia, because that's really the only place you can come from. You can't
Yeah.
come across the desert there.
Yeah.
And you're definitely not from Egypt,
Mhm.
because they're very different.
Yes.
And so, this has to be some sort of Mesopotamian connection there.
Yeah. Well, and there's thought that the Hivites came from somewhere north of this area, not too long before this. And so these Gibeonites are ethnically Hivites, and so they may be telling the half-truth here in that they kind of are from a distant country, a distant land, but that's not where they are now, and they're making this treaty under false pretenses.
Right, in Judges, we find Hivites living around Lebanon.
Yeah.
So that's not a great distance away, but either they ran up there
Yeah.
during the conquest, or they were already there.
Yeah.
Stopped there and lived there on the way from wherever they came from,
Right.
something like that. But
Yes.
they're definitely not just in that one location.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, lots of interesting little wrinkles here that make it a plausible deception. Things that the Israelites might believe. They got the flattery of the Israelites and their God. They've got tangible proof of their clothes and provisions and supplies. Just enough evidence that it will sway the Israelites if they're a little bit too hasty. And the thing is the Israelites aren't stupid. Like, they are suspicious at the right points here. They are asking the right questions. They just give up a little too soon. Question number 3, why do the leaders of it? Yes, please.
Well, there's more to it than what you just said. One of the big things, actually the biggest thing in there, they heard about what God did for Israel. Became afraid, then deceived, came to deceive. So I think it was out of fear for being destroyed.
Yeah.
So the thing that's most interesting to me, they allow themselves to deceive Israelites. They never counseled God.
Right.
Find it, it's not there.
Yeah,
So that's the biggest problem here.
it is.
And regardless of what we say about this or that, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And so we look in Exodus 23 where God specifically commands, don't join with them, basically. And they just did it. I'm surprised that God didn't just, for not talking to him and asking him. And had they had counsel with God, it's very likely he would have told about the deception.
Right. Yeah, so much of the story of Joshua is contrasting how things go when they are listening to God and asking God versus how things go when they do things on their own. Ida?
That's a great point. And I think it's a great lesson for us today. Because we can hear lots of people talk about God. And they might know their Bible. But we shouldn't be deceived into thinking that they are truly following God.
Yeah, there's a good point there too, that the knowledge of God is not exactly the same thing as serving God and following God. The Gibeonites show some of that here. Mark?
Yeah, I like your earlier point about a lot of this pointing right back at us. Because they were ripe for the deceit. These were new conquests. They weren't an acting army these were not seasoned warriors. They were getting seasoned. Everything is new. They were ripe for the deception. And that's why I brought up the fact that they're hearing, and we'll be your slaves. Oh yeah, these are the kinds of things God talked about. Just like you were talking about. It fit perfectly with what they heard from God. And you're getting to the point now that they forgot to talk to God.
Yeah. And you can imagine that going through their heads of like, well, we have the tangible proof here. Like why do we need to counsel God when it's this obvious? Why do we need to counsel God when it's this cut and dry? We don't just counsel or get God's counsel and get God's involvement in things when we are confused. We do it always. Because sometimes there's deceit involved. Yeah, so we're kind of answering question number 3 of why do the leaders of Israel make a mistake? And it's because they're not counseling God. They're not hearing what God wants them to do. And it's so easy to imagine how quickly this would have been resolved if they asked God, should we make this covenant with them? And God says, no, they are not who they are telling you they are. They are actually from Gibeon. So go to Gibeon, or whatever it is that God's going to tell them to do with them. And we don't have to presume what the answer is going to be. Just whatever God wants them to do with Gibeon, they can do. And they can do it by faith, do it with the knowledge that this is, in fact, what God wants them to do. Unfortunately, they're going their own way here. They're basically asking, basically going off of the evidence and the thoughts that they have instead of asking God what he thinks about it. And so they're showing some very poor judgment here. They're allowing the Gibeonites to be evasive and not answer the actual question. They are not seeking counsel from God. And so they do go ahead and make this covenant. And everybody's happy for about 3 days until they realize what has happened. Dave.
Well, that's the big problem right there. Is that when they heard, I know it's been commented that it hurts when the slave, doesn't matter. They were not supposed to make the covenant.
Right. No, they're not.
In the story.
Yeah.
So that now you're violating the God command.
Yeah.
And so it just goes to show you when we do what we want and not look to God and ask him what we should be doing, there lies the problem. We get all kinds of problems from that.
This is about to get really messy because of that. What should be a clear-cut next step in the process ends up being really, really messy. And we have some tough questions to answer for the remaining part of the chapter. And they had some tough decisions to make because this all got a lot more complicated than it had to. When it all comes into the light and they realize what they've done, now they're caught where every decision they make is a bad one. And that is the nature of sin a lot of times. When you get involved in sin, it a lot of times gets you into that spot where every decision you make hurts in some way. Anything else through verse 15 before we look at the consequences? Yes, Andrea.
It just goes to show that it's very important not to let your guard down and always confide in God. Even when you think you're doing the right decision, it's important to always go back and they should have gone back and asked the Lord, are we supposed to do this? And not just trust their own instincts. That always ends up being one thing.
Right. They're fresh off of a victory. They've just kind of rededicated their covenant with God. They've constructed this altar. They've read the law. Everyone's feeling good. That is not the time to stop doing your due diligence. That is not the time to stop asking God what we ought to do. And we can get lulled into the false sense of security, the sort of spiritual high we get off of worshiping God together with brethren, off of a good Bible study, off of a good victory in something. That's not the time to let your guard down. Because very often Satan follows that up with a challenge, an opportunity for you to fall, and a lot of times we go head first into it. And that's what we see the Israelites doing too often, is they're alternating between a good, sincere victory, faithful victory, and then some sort of failure afterwards. Okay. Anything else? Consequences. Like I said, the rest of the chapter gets really messy. It gets so complicated here and hard to read, hard to answer the questions of what the right thing for them to do is. Everything gets so much harder once they've made this covenant with Gibeon, and that's kind of the point. So just as a note, remember the people are ethnically Hivites or Hivites, and they come from the city of Gibeon. Gibeon is the kind of lead city or capital city of a collection of 4 cities found there in verse 17. And so that's why the text kind of goes back and forth between calling them Hivites and Gibeonites. One is their ethnicity, one is the city that they're from. And these 4 cities that we see in verse 17 are all associated with Gibeon and associated with these people. So the covenant they've made with the Gibeonites stretches to these 4 cities. Question number 4. Why do the leaders refuse to attack the various Gibeonite cities? They made an oath. Okay. I told you this gets complicated, right? They made an oath. They swore to have peace with these people. Why can't they just say, well, you deceived us, so this covenant's null and void?
Well, they'd be breaking God's command by breaking an oath. Being dishonest. And
Yeah. See, it's complicated, right? That's not a good thing to do. Right?
Well, it is because it is a covenant and not a contract.
Yeah.
Covenants are very specific things. And you really have to know what a covenant is. Because if you don't know what it is or you ignore what it is, you really can't understand certain parts of the Bible. You'll end up getting translated wrong and those kinds of things. As we can see in the book of Hebrews, it's translated wrong and gives an entirely different wrong idea of what's going on with Christ.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that a covenant is a statement by 2 different people that binds each person to the covenant, not to each other.
Yeah.
And so if the other person goes away from the covenant, you're still bound to it,
Yeah.
which is not the case of a contract. In the case of a contract, if one person breaks the contract is broken. You cannot break a covenant.
Right. Yeah. So very good point here, because a lot of times, we use contracts as a way of helping to understand something of what a covenant is, but they're not exactly the same thing. And that helps us to get the complexity of this. So in our country, we have legal provisions that if I swindle you into a contract, if I have deceived you and gotten you to sign something by the use of deception, then you can probably get that contract declared null and void by a judge that it was not proper. But this isn't exactly a contract. This is a covenant, and they have invoked the name of God as well. And it is a serious thing to back out of this covenant, to say we are going to break this covenant now when you've invoked the name of God, when you have declared a covenant between you and these people. It is not a simple thing just to say we're not going to do it. We take it back. That's not how it works. And so they are bound to this whether they like it or not.
So a covenant would probably be what the judge uses to make the judgment of a contract. He's using the covenant of the law to decide how to judge it.
Kind of, yeah. There's some connection there, yeah, for sure. This has involved the name of God and involved some very serious promises here that don't just allow you to break it without consequences. So the leaders are saying, if we break this, then God's going to be angry with us. We violated his commandment. We violated this covenant that we've made. It's going to show that God's name means nothing, because we've made this covenant in the name of Yahweh, yet we're going to attack you anyway. It's going to make them ripe for punishment from God. It's a mess. But on the other hand, this covenant shouldn't have been made in the first place. So this is what I mean by it's messy. They're in the situation that basically anything they do is a bad thing, and that's the story of sin. Sin complicates situations. Sin makes things messy. I do find it interesting that they're still not asking God what they ought to do. Even once this has come out, they still don't ask God, is this covenant valid? What is better for us to do? Should we attack them anyway, or should we honor the covenant now? They're just sort of caught. Barry?
Well, they should have asked them way up front.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they learned their lesson about not asking God about going to war
Mhm.
and how they're going to conquer. But they compartmentalized that.
Mhm.
And they said, okay, asking God is about going to war,
Yeah,
not about making covenants,
right.
what it is.
Yeah. Everything is about asking God. that's the point of the covenant relationship God has with them, that their lives are ruled by Him. And this whole event of invading the nation, invading Canaan, is going to be done God's way. Andrea?
I'm just wondering the reasons why they didn't go to God. I'm wondering, like, since they made a mistake, might they be embarrassed to,
Yeah?
like, acknowledge that we kind of, like, messed up.
Yeah.
Now we're, like, in this tough spot. You know, it's kind of, like, when you're, like, I feel like when you have your mom and dad, and then you go and do what you think is best, and then they're like, well, you should always go and seek your parents' advice, before doing something, and then you do it anyways, and it's like, now you feel embarrassed. And
Sure.
you're like, I told you so, or you
Yeah.
should have done that, or.
I'm sure they are embarrassed. I'm sure they're afraid too, because like they have disobeyed God, and there's not an easy solution out of this. It's no wonder that they're kind of wanting to see if they can fix it themselves. That's a natural reaction that many of us have. Kids do that before bringing the problem to their parents. Employees do that before bringing the problem to the boss. It's like, let's see if I can fix my mistake, and then it's less of a problem. I think that's kind of what they're trying to do here. Gary.
Didn't the law say way before this, if you don't conquer all the nations like you're told, they're going to be a thorn in your side?
Mhm.
Why? It's interesting that came up.
Yes.
It's going to be a thorn in your side.
And this is one example of that, even to a more moderate degree than what we're going to see later on in Joshua, of some of the parts of land that they just don't even go and attack, that they just stop before they're done. Here there are a few mitigating factors, and so the problem is a little bit more moderate, but it is still thorny and it is still an issue. They're definitely caught between two bad situations. And no matter what they do, it's going to be awkward and difficult. Yes, okay.
Well, aren't they in a covenant relationship with God? And
Yeah.
shouldn't that supersede any other covenant relationship?
Well, that's the whole thing, right? Like now you have two covenants, both involving the name of God, both that do contradict each other to some degree. And that's the question. That's what is the right thing to do here? Mark?
Yeah, God would not have his name would have been blasphemy had they broken that covenant.
Yeah, it would have, absolutely. That, these Israelites come in and they make a covenant in the name of their God that they'll make peace with you, and then they attack you anyway. They clearly don't revere their God. It doesn't matter if you make a covenant in the name of Yahweh or not. Yeah, it's a mess because you've got that on one side, and then here on the other side, they have a prior covenant with God directly on instructions on what they're supposed to do. But this is what I mean of it being a mess.
I think the bigger question becomes, for me when I'm looking at it, is do the Gibeonites become a major sinful issue later? And I haven't really looked into it a lot. I kind of skimmed through to find what happens with them. And we do see some issues with Saul later.
Mhm.
But that was his problem. It wasn't something that they perpetuated the way I was looking at it.
The Gibeonites are complicated.
So it may have been, and I'm saying this without looking into it, it may have been that the Gibeonites were being sincere with this.
Yeah, and that's
Maybe
kind
they were
of,
simple people.
yeah, that's kind of to Barry's point from before, and I think there's an element of that here, that there is a little connection, and we'll talk about this some more in a minute, of some similarities between what they do and what Rahab does. There's some differences too, but there are some similarities. Yikes. Okay. So yeah, the people are grumbling against the leaders. We have a parallel here to what happened in the wilderness, that the people were grumbling against the leaders, but unlike in the wilderness, the people are right here. The people are saying, what did you do and why did you do it? This is a terrible decision, and they've got a lot of problems. So question number 5, let's compare the response and actions that the Gibeonites had to Rahab. What is it that the Gibeonites said about God? Mark.
They were concerned, they heard about the fame of God.
Yes.
Rahab's response was more, your God is God.
Yes. They use some similar wording to a point, but Rahab goes farther. Rahab says, your God is God. He is God of in heaven and on earth below. The Gibeonites don't say that. The Gibeonites respect the power of God, and they seem to realize that he's going to win, but I'm not convinced that they've moved beyond the my God is a weapon and your God is a weapon, and we just recognize that your weapon is stronger than ours. I think that's where the Gibeonites are at this moment, that they are surrendering because they realize that Yahweh is stronger than their gods, but they're not in the place of complete faith that Rahab was in. Even though Rahab didn't know everything, Rahab recognized that Yahweh was the one true God. And so that creates a difference in outcome as well. Because what happened with Rahab in her transition from Jericho and salvation, kind of what did she become?
She lived with the Israelites.
She lived with the Israelites, basically as one of them. What happened to the Gibeonites?
Humiliated.
They're humiliated. They're servants, they're slaves, they're not really on equal footing with the Israelites. But yes,
Going
very.
into Solomon's day, Solomon used them as slave
Yeah.
labor for his work.
Yeah.
But it doesn't appear that they ever said, well, let the God of Israel be our God.
Right.
And so I think that's an insight into the reason God says you have to destroy these nations.
hmm
They are not going to exterminate.
Right.
So you have to remove them out of there. Otherwise, you're going to become like them, and then I don't have a people.
Yeah. And that is the complication with the Gibeonites. If they don't declare God their God, they're not really giving themselves over to him, they're just surrendering. And so they remain in this state where they are serving the Israelites, not able to be eradicated because of the covenant. But the little sliver of redemption here is how in particular are they serving? Not just generically as slaves everywhere, although I'm sure that develops some in the future.
They were cutting wood and they were carrying water,
For,
the Israel.
but not just generically for the Israelites, for the Levites, for the worship of the Lord, for the sacrifices, for the altars, and all these things. They are kind of on the periphery of the worship of the Lord. Therefore, there's an opportunity for the Gibeonites that if they're ever going to declare God as their God, they have just enough exposure to be able to see it and to make that choice in the future. So they're not welcomed in like Rahab and her family were. But they exist in this state of slaves, and they're somewhat involved in the worship of the Lord in the hopes that one day they might declare God as their God. And we don't really see anything in chapter 9 about what God thinks of all this, but in chapter 10, which we'll get into next week, he gives somewhat a grudging stamp of approval on the whole thing, not as the intent from the beginning, but based on what you have done so far, that's the way that it should be now. So the course of things has changed for the Gibeonites, and it wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be, but it will have to do. Okay? Last questions or comments? We've got about a minute left. Mark.
Joshua insults them, the way I saw it. He
Yes.
insulted them. It's like, you should have fought him and died. Now you're gonna be slaves. And they were happy with that,
Yes.
because they chose life.
Right.
And that kind of, to me, answered that last question
Yeah.
about where's the redemption part of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you attach yourself that's going to something that's going to keep you alive.
Yeah, it's a smaller, weaker version of what Rahab did. And it's, I guess, mildly to be commended, but mostly it's just the fear and the deceit being used there. And so that's why they give a difference of outcome. Thank you very much, everybody. Good discussion today. Next week, we will go on to the next lesson.
I don't know, they talk.